The sun rises over the Egyptian desert, painting the dunes in molten gold. For a fleeting moment, the pyramids seem divine, monuments of eternal perfection, untouched by time. But behind that radiant glow hides something much darker, something the gods themselves might have turned away from. For centuries, we've been told the story of grandeur, the pharaohs as demigods, their tombs as symbols of divine order, and the builders as devoted servants of the sun. But what if that vision is a lie, crafted from blood and dust? What if those same hands that shaped eternity were broken long before the final stone was laid? Imagine standing there, the air thick with sand and sweat, the roar of command echoing across miles of limestone. The workers' backs glisten not with the light of Ra, but with blood that never dries. Beneath every stone lies a man who was promised eternity and given only torment. They weren't heroes of labor. They were sacrifices to a god made of stone. Historians glorify the architectural genius. Tourists gaze in awe. Yet almost no one dares to ask, what did it cost to raise a tomb that could touch the sky? The truth is, the price was not gold but flesh. Every inch of polished limestone hides the agony of those condemned to serve in silence, men swallowed by the desert, whose names were erased so that one man's name could shine forever. The pyramids are not only tombs, they are prisons of memory. They hold not just the mummified pharaoh, but the spirits of countless workers buried beneath layers of secrecy. Their screams were the foundation, their bones, the mortar. The Egyptians called it divine order, Ma'at. But to those who carried the stones, it was a nightmare masquerading as destiny. So next time you see the pyramids glimmering under the sun, ask yourself, is this beauty or horror carved in stone? Because what the pharaohs did to the pyramid workers was worse than you could ever imagine. If this truth unsettled you, drop a comment below. What do you think truly lies beneath those stones? Don't forget to like this video if history should be told raw and unfiltered, and subscribe to uncover more of the darkness buried in the ancient world. They came from the banks of the Nile, peasants, farmers, fishermen, men who had nothing but their calloused hands and the promise of survival. The pharaoh's call was not a request. It was a decree that rippled through every village like the hiss of a serpent. Come build eternity, they said. Serve the divine order. But those who obeyed did not build eternity. They were swallowed by it. They were told they were chosen by the gods, destined to carve the resting place of the living sun. Yet, behind the sacred words and gilded rituals, the truth was far less divine. These men were not volunteers. They were conscripted labor, drafted under the illusion of duty, chained by superstition and hunger. To refuse was to defy the divine. And in Egypt, defiance was death. Every morning before the sun rose, they gathered like shadows at the foot of the great stone quarries. Their bodies were thin, wrapped in linen stained by dust and sweat. Overseers shouted orders from elevated platforms, their whips slashing through the air with a sound that split the dawn. The men moved in unison, like extensions of the same tortured being. Their rhythm was not one of pride, but of survival, a heartbeat of pain echoing through the desert. Their food was coarse bread, beer, mixed with water, and sometimes dried fish if fortune smiled. But the true nourishment came from the illusion of purpose, that by building the tomb of a god, they might secure a place in the afterlife. They clung to that hope like a drowning man to driftwood, even as their fingers bled and their lungs filled with sand. Those who faltered were quietly removed. No one spoke of where they went. Some said they were taken to rest in the shade. Others whispered they were buried beneath the very stones they failed to lift. The desert did not give back what it consumed, and still they worked. Day after day, year after year. Generations of men who never saw the structure complete. Fathers buried in the same dust their sons would later inhale. A cycle of obedience masquerading as honor. They believed they were building something eternal, and they were. Just not for themselves. because the Pharaohs' eternity demanded their extinction. The men who carried the sun were never meant to see its light. They were told they were free, that they served the will of the gods, that every stone laid brought balance to the universe. But freedom, in the shadow of the Pharaoh, was nothing more than a mirage, shimmering, unreachable, cruel. In the eyes of history, they weren't slaves. No chains, no shackles, no auction blocks. The modern myth paints them as workers paid in bread and beer, men proud to serve the sun. But dig beneath that polished surface and you find the truth. The most effective slavery is the one where the victim believes he is blessed. The Pharaoh's architects understood this perfectly. They didn't need iron to bind men. They used faith. They used fear. They wrapped the people in invisible cords woven from divine commandments. Every edict, every hymn, every prayer whispered by priests reminded them that disobedience wasn't rebellion. It was blasphemy. And blasphemy carried a punishment far worse than death, the erasure of the soul. That belief made the whips unnecessary. The men worked under the weight of guilt and hope, enslaved by the illusion that their suffering was sacred. They labored in the sun until their skin cracked and peeled, believing that each wound was an offering to the gods. Their chains clinked only in their dreams. Priests walked among them, whispering promises of paradise in the field of reeds, the Egyptian heaven where rivers never dried and pain was forgotten. "Work well," they said, "and Ra will remember your name." But Ra remembered only one name, that of the Pharaoh. The rest were lost, swept away by the desert wind. Some men began to question. They whispered doubts in the dark corners of the camps, asking whether the gods truly needed pyramids, or if the gods were simply men wearing gold masks. Those whispers never lasted long. The overseers were always listening. Doubt was infection, and infection had to be cut out before it spread. The lie persisted because it was beautiful. To die for a god felt noble. To live for oneself felt forbidden. And so they built, generation after generation, convinced they were walking toward eternity while sinking deeper into oblivion. The truth of Egypt's glory was built not on slavery of the body, but on the captivity of the mind, a prison so perfect that no one ever tried to escape. The desert had no mercy, and neither did the Pharaoh's overseers. In the heat that burned flesh from bone, discipline was divine law. To falter was to offend the gods. To bleed was to be purified by their wrath. The sound of the whip was constant, a rhythm that ruled the air like a cruel heartbeat. Its crack tore through the wind, echoing across the quarries and scaffolds. Overseers wielded it not just to command obedience, but to remind every man that his life was dust beneath royal sandals. The whip was not a tool of punishment. It was a symbol, the voice of the gods, speaking through pain. The men worked in silence. They had learned that screams changed nothing. The sand drank the blood before it reached the ground, leaving no trace, only the memory of pain that lingered like smoke. Those who resisted were made examples, publicly beaten, publicly erased. The sun bore witness to their humiliation, and the others watched, their hearts trembling in their chests like frightened birds. The overseers came in many forms. Some were soldiers, hardened and cruel. Others were priests, claiming divine authority to punish in the name of Ma'at, balance and order. They, said the whip restored harmony, that pain was sacred discipline. But the truth was simpler. It was control. A man broken by pain was easier to command than one moved by faith. There were days when men collapsed from exhaustion. Their bodies refused to rise, their vision fading beneath the desert glare. The overseers never hesitated. A strike, 2, 3. The crack of leather cut through the sound of shifting stones until the man either rose or never moved again. If he died, his name was scratched from the record as if he had never existed. The pyramid would rise, but his story would be buried inside it. At night, The workers whispered about the whip as if it were alive, a serpent with a thirst for blood, fed daily by human hands. Some claimed to hear it even in their dreams, slithering through the darkness, waiting. The overseers laughed at their fear, but they too knew that something unholy lingered in that sound, something that did not come from men. And yet, each morning, the sun rose again, and the same rhythm began anew, the chant of labor, the scream of leather, the endless voice of divine cruelty echoing across eternity. Because in Egypt, pain was not punishment. It was the language of the gods. Tell me in the comments, do you think the pharaohs believed this brutality was sacred, or simply necessary? By the time the sun reached its zenith, the air itself became an enemy. The wind carried dust sharp enough to cut the skin, and the men's lungs filled with it, until breathing became a slow, grinding pain. The pyramid was rising, but so were the graves. There was no record of how many died. The scribes didn't write about them. They wrote about perfection, geometry, the divine proportions of eternity. Not about the men coughing blood, their ribs showing through paper-thin flesh. Not about the eyes that went blind from the glare of polished limestone. Not about the silence that followed when the weak could no longer rise. The silence. That was the Pharaoh's true currency. When a worker collapsed, there were no cries, no mourning. The desert did not allow grief. The overseers dragged the bodies away before the flies gathered, before anyone dared to speak their names. The camps learned quickly that sorrow was rebellion. Emotion was weakness. So they built walls inside themselves, stronger than the ones rising around them. The physicians, when they came, were not healers. They were instruments of denial. They treated wounds only to keep the labor going. A broken arm splinted with reeds, a torn back wrapped in linen, a dying man told to serve until his heart rests. Even death was turned into service. Some were buried beneath unfinished corridors, their bodies sealed inside the very stones they had carried. The architects called it efficiency. Illness spread like whispers, fever, infection, and the strange rot that came from endless sweat under linen and sun. But no one spoke of it. Fear silenced everything. The fear of being replaced, the fear of divine punishment, the fear that their suffering was meaningless. The Pharaoh's decree was simple. Only the living build eternity. But eternity consumed the living faster than any god. The men's silence became the mortar that held the pyramid together. Unspoken agony pressed into every layer. Even the priests avoided the camps after sunset. They said the air was heavy with the dead. The truth was, they feared the soundless ghosts that moved through the dunes, the ones whose voices had been taken long before their lives. The pyramids still stand today, but if you listen closely, when the wind passes through the cracks, it doesn't sound like air. It sounds like breathing. The breathing of those who were never allowed to speak. The Nile was the giver of life. Its waters turned desert into paradise, feeding the crops and the people. But far from its glittering banks, where the sun scorched the skin and the earth cracked underfoot, the river of life turned into a river of blood. For every block of limestone dragged across the sand, a man's body broke. For every stone set in perfect alignment, another soul slipped quietly into the earth. The Pharaoh's architects measured with precision, but their calculations never included the human cost. The desert did. It counted every drop. The work was relentless. Stones weighing tons were pulled by hundreds of men using ropes that carved deep into their flesh. Blood mixed with sweat, turning the sand beneath their feet a dark crimson mud. When one man fell, another took his place before the body was even cold. The line of labor never stopped, not even when the air filled with the smell of death. At night, the wind carried strange sounds across the camps, moans, prayers, sometimes laughter from men who had gone mad beneath the weight of endless toil. They said the gods walked among them in the dark, faceless beings who watched the suffering with quiet hunger. The priests told them it was Ra testing their devotion. But deep inside they knew No god would demand this much pain. Disease turned the camps into open graves. The Nile gave them water, but it also brought sickness, stagnant pools breeding death. Insects swarmed over wounds that never healed. Fever spread faster than whispers. The men believed they were cursed, but the overseers blamed weakness. The strong will rise again, they said, as they buried the weak beneath layers of sand. Even the river seemed to reject the truth. When the water turned red during the flood season, priests called it divine blessing. The Nile drinks the blood of the righteous. But the workers knew better. They had seen their brothers fall into its current, their bodies carried away like offerings to a god who never answered. Generations later, when the desert winds uncovered bones near the quarries, the archaeologists spoke of lost laborers as if they were numbers. They weren't. They were men who gave everything, their strength, their names, their breath, so that eternity could stand tall against the horizon. And eternity, it seems, was built on the color of blood. They stood above the workers like gods made of flesh and arrogance, the architects of eternity. Draped in linen finer than gold, their hands never touched stone, yet their words could break bones. They were the Pharaohs' chosen minds, the men who turned divinity into blueprints, who calculated perfection while surrounded by imperfection, who believed cruelty was not sin but structure. Their names were recorded in hieroglyphs, their faces carved on temple walls. Theirs were the visions of heaven, and the nightmares of those forced to build it. They spoke of harmony and sacred geometry, yet they ruled through fear and humiliation. Every lash, every punishment, every body buried alive in the foundations was ordered in the name of precision. They called themselves servants of the gods, but their devotion was to something darker, the pursuit of immortality, through control. In their eyes, the workers were not men. They were measurements, variables in a divine equation. If 1,000 died, it was a fair price for a line of symmetry. If a man's spine cracked beneath the weight of a stone, they said the gods demanded balance. They believed the human body was expendable. Stone was eternal. Flesh was not. From their platforms of polished granite, they looked down upon the endless labor below. They saw beauty in the rhythm of suffering, in the way hundreds of men moved as one organism of pain, and when someone collapsed, they marked it not as tragedy but as error, a flaw in the design. The overseers punished the flaw, the architects corrected the order. At night, they met with priests to discuss the alignment of stars, the angle of sunlight on the king's tomb, the perfection of eternity. None spoke of the cries echoing from the camps. None dared. The architects convinced themselves that pain purified creation, that to build something divine, one must destroy what is human. History remembers their genius. The pyramids stand as their triumph. But buried within that triumph is something foul, a legacy of hearts that beat without empathy, of minds that shaped death into beauty. Their brilliance was undeniable. So was their cruelty. And perhaps in the end, they too were prisoners, not of chains, but of obsession. For those who dream of eternity are often willing to sacrifice everything mortal to achieve it. What do you think? Were these architects visionaries, or monsters who worshipped perfection more than life itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. When the final stone was set, and the chants of the priests echoed into the night, silence fell over the desert like a shroud. The work was done. The Pharaoh's tomb, the so-called House of Eternity, stood complete. But beneath its perfection, beneath the sand that still shimmered with blood and tears, lay another kind of tomb, one never meant to be opened. The workers who built the pyramid were not all permitted to leave. Some were kept behind to seal the corridors, to close the hidden chambers, to bury the Pharaoh's passage to the next world. They were told it was an honor. They believed, perhaps, that their sacrifice would grant them a place beside the God-King in the afterlife. But the architects had other plans. When the last sarcophagus was lowered into its chamber, when the walls were painted with the hymns of eternity, the exits were sealed. not just for the dead king but for the living who built his tomb. The workers were locked inside, their torches burning low, their chants turning into cries. The stone door closed, and their voices faded into the dark, blending forever with the silence of the Pharaoh. The priests called it purification. The desert called it burial. History called it mystery. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover signs, skeletons found behind sealed walls, fingerprints preserved in ancient mortar, tools abandoned mid-swing. The evidence whispered a truth too terrible to admit. The tomb was not merely a resting place, it was a mass grave. There were secrets buried deeper still. Hidden corridors, false chambers, and traps designed not to protect treasure, but to hide the truth. Inscriptions deliberately erased, names scratched out, hieroglyphs altered to conceal what really happened within those walls. The Pharaoh's afterlife depended on deception. The more the truth was hidden, the more divine he became. And beneath the pyramids, in chambers untouched by sunlight for millennia, lay remnants that spoke louder than any text. Human remains contorted in agony, bones fractured, mouths open in eternal screams. Not sacrifices, victims. The air within those chambers is still heavy, they say. Those who enter describe a silence so dense it feels alive, as if the stones themselves remember. The energy of those who died unwillingly lingers, restless. Perhaps that is why every explorer who enters feels watched, not by the Pharaoh but by the countless souls buried to protect his eternity. The pyramids were meant to guard the dead, but the dead inside were never kings. They were the forgotten, the builders, the sealed, the silenced. And the sands above them whisper still, carrying the echoes of those who built eternity and were buried beneath it. The pyramids still rise above the sands, untouched by time, but their shadows stretch far beyond the desert. For the Egyptians, fear was not a curse, it was a system, a structure as carefully designed as the stones that built their monuments, and it endured long after the last block was laid. The Pharaoh ruled not only through armies and laws, but through terror woven into faith. Every story, every ritual, every image carved in stone reminded the people that death was not the end, it was judgment. The gods watched every act, weighed every heart. To question the divine order was to risk annihilation in this life and the next. Fear became the mortar of society. It held everything together. The throne, the temple, the silence. Priests whispered of the duat, the underworld, a labyrinth of fire, serpents, and darkness where the wicked wandered for eternity. They described horrors so vivid that even the cruelest overseer paled before them. And who decided what was wicked? The Pharaoh. His word was the measure of purity, his wrath, the instrument of justice, his mercy, the only salvation. It was a brilliant deception, a kingdom built on devotion maintained through dread. Even when the workers slept, their dreams were filled with warnings, serpents coiling around the stars, gods with the heads of beasts judging their souls. They believed the only path to safety was obedience, so they obeyed, generation after generation, building the very symbols that imprisoned them. The legacy of fear did not die with Egypt's dynasties. It spread, like a shadow crossing time. The idea that power must be divine, that suffering is sacred, that control is justified if it serves eternity. The pyramids became the first propaganda, colossal reminders that men are small and rulers are gods. And though the sands have shifted, the message remains carved in stone. Greatness demands sacrifice. Obedience ensures survival, and fear is the foundation upon which empires stand. Even now, as tourists walk their ancient corridors, the air hums with the echo of that fear, a low vibration that crawls beneath the skin. It's not the fear of death, but of truth. The truth that humanity, for all its progress, still kneels before the same invisible gods, power, order, and silence. The Egyptians mastered eternity, but what they truly perfected was control. The pyramid was meant to be a monument of glory, a stairway to the heavens, a declaration that man could touch eternity. Yet when the desert wind howls through its hollow chambers, it carries not songs of triumph, but whispers of suffering. The monument that was supposed to celebrate divinity stands instead as a memorial to human agony. Its perfect lines and golden angles dazzle the eye, but behind that perfection lies chaos, the chaos of lives extinguished, of dreams ground into dust. Every block of stone is a confession, carved not by reverence but by desperation. Each mark of the chisel was a heartbeat lost, a prayer unanswered. For the pharaoh, the pyramid was salvation. For those who built it, it was damnation. They were promised eternity, but not in the way they imagined. Their eternity became this: a monument that endures, a structure that outlived its makers, and a silence that speaks louder than any hymn. When you stand before the Great Pyramid today, it's easy to feel awe. But if you listen closely, truly listen, you'll hear something beneath the wind, beneath the chatter of tourists and the clicking of cameras. A pulse, a low hum, the sound of suffering fossilized in stone. Because the pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a mirror. It reflects the cost of greatness, the cruelty hidden within beauty, the sacrifices that power demands and then forgets. The ancients built it to house a god. Instead, they built a reminder that no god ever rises without a mountain of bones beneath him. And yet, that is what makes it eternal. Pain endures. It outlasts empires. It carves itself into memory, into legend, into stone. The pharaohs are dust now, their names fading beneath the sands, but the agony of their builders still stands tall, unbroken, immortal. The pyramid was meant to defeat death. Instead, it became the monument of death's victory. If this story made you see the pyramids in a new light, leave a comment below with the phrase, "Pain never dies." Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the darkest corners of ancient history, and watch our next video, where we uncover the horrors buried beneath Rome's eternal empire.